So without further ado, we will begin today's webinar. Welcome to everyone who's joining us for October's webinar. Today, it will be myself and Chris Holt. I'm delighted to welcome Chris to this webinar. Chris has done a couple of sessions with us before, and sadly it's very timely that Chris is with us today. I've known Chris for over a decade now, and he is a true expert in security matters and also malicious risks. Chris is a preeminent expert in this area. For me, he is my absolute go-to guy in this organization, and I know that he's going to be sharing some really well-informed insights and guidance for us over the next hour. Before throwing it over to Chris, I know there are a number of you on the call who have not met me before, so a quick introduction to me too. I'm Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We're a specialist crisis management consultancy, and we work with leaders of organizations to help them do and say the right things on the most challenging days of their business lives. Everything from cyber attacks to product recalls to terrorism, fraudulent behavior, accidents and incidents of all kinds. And we do that through crisis management planning, training and rehearsal. Clearly, the risks that Chris and his organization CHC Global specialize in very much form part of that risk landscape. And Chris, maybe if you just say a couple of words about CHC Global, what you do, your area of expertise, and then we'll get into the meat of the presentation.
Of course. You can hear me okay, I hope, Jonathan.
Perfectly, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so as you say, and I think when we had lunch recently to discuss this session, we realized it is just over a decade that we've been collaborating in a number of areas. Yeah. So my name's Chris Holt. For those of you I've not met, I've spent around a decade or so in the British Army, predominantly working in counter-terrorism from the mid-90s into the mid-noughties, and I've subsequently spent the last 15 years or so working in the Lloyd's of London insurance market, focused on the area of malicious risks, which I might talk about in a moment. So we are an advisor and an insurance intermediary. So we help organizations understand and then manage and then transfer their risk into the insurance market. But a heavy component of what we do is work on that understand piece. And I'll cover that off today. So in terms of our arc, if you like, of focus, for us, malicious risks we define as deliberate actions intended to cause significant harm, loss, or disruption. And I think it might be useful just to say that in the insurance context, therefore for us, that means political violence, which includes terrorism, but all forms of political violence, so rebellion, revolution, coup d'etat, strikes, riots, civil commotion, those types of things. It involves kidnap and extortive crime. And in that area, we also get involved with supporting individuals or organizations that are under threat. We provide advice on traveling to or operating in hostile or non-permissive environments. And then finally, we deal with the hostile components of cyber risk. So that's where we sit. And I'm the CEO of the group. And I'm also the chairman of one of our wholly owned subsidiaries, which is an insurance company called Samfire.
Thank you. And this clearly wasn't planned the next 3 or 4 minutes, but obviously we are in the middle of, or maybe at the beginning of, a very significant conflict at the moment. We clearly don't want to get into the politics today. It's sensitive as well as horrific, but Chris, given your area of expertise, maybe 3 or 4 minutes on what you're seeing and the implications of that for people on this call.
Yeah, of course. And look, I've spent nearly 30 years dealing with pretty horrific events, and I don't think you ever get numb to this type of thing. Some of what we're all seeing on the news is pretty unsettling. As you say, I don't really propose to run through any of the detail. I think, you know, we can all access either the BBC or the FT or other kind of credible reporting lines around the detail. I think what I would say is, you know, we've had a horrific terrorist attack with some brutal violence, and I'm not a Middle Eastern expert. I've kind of spent quite a lot of time working in that region and dealing with issues from there, but I'm not a kind of defined Middle East expert, but I know a number of them, and I've spoken to a number over the last week. And one thing that struck me is that none of those individuals were predicting this as a credible scenario beforehand. And I think we'll come on to this later, that this was outside of what people might have expected. I think, you know, Israel in their response is probably going to, well, is going to seek to respond to Hamas by attempting to destroy and, you know, disassemble Hamas infrastructure. And I think there's probably some predictable and terrible collateral that'll occur as a result. I think she needs to provide suitable deterrence to her other enemies. Certainly it seems clear that Israel wants to confine her operations to a single front if she possibly can. There's that balance then of maintaining support of her international allies, and then somewhere down the list at the moment is recover the hostages if at all possible. But it's, as you say, it's a pretty unsettling and awful position. I think from a more how might this affect the wider region perspective, we appear to be in a strategic cul-de-sac, and the question that well-informed people seem to be asking is, how do we find an exit ramp? Who's going to de-escalate, or who's going to help navigate that de-escalation from where we are now once this initial phase is over? In terms of the kind of more general observations, recognizing, of course, that violence and suffering is probably the key issue at the moment, I think it is worth noting that the Israeli economy is well integrated with both EU and US economies. It is an exporting nation. 95% of everything that Israel exports goes through its ports, and the vast majority of those, for example, are within missile range of the Hezbollah missile capabilities. I had a look before the call and note that the yields on Jordanian and Egyptian dollar-denominated debt have increased, not significantly, but they have increased, and there's a real upward trend. And those two economies are certainly very dependent on tourism, so we'll see how that plays out. There's a potential for a refugee crisis. You know, there's around 1 million people on the move, and they're going to have to go somewhere. So we'll see how, for example, the EU responds after the friction that occurred after the EU response to the Syrian refugee crisis. I note that currently there's a small oil price rise, things like reduction in aviation stocks. But I think it's fair to say that if Iran becomes involved in anything apart from, you know, an information way, then we are likely to see a spike in oil and LNG prices, particularly if there's any bad behaviour in the Straits of Hormuz. And that's inevitably then going to have a knock-on in global markets. And I think I direct people, there's a really fascinating piece of analysis done by Bloomberg on potential impacts to both GDP and inflation if Iran do become involved. I think likely they'll be engaged by proxies, which everyone's watching very well, very closely at the moment. Just a final couple of points around the impacts of political polarization. So, and this is a slightly kind of secondary or perhaps even tertiary point, but one of the things that we note is that when organizations, and that includes kind of states, but when organizations become focused on polarizing subjects, attention is often then taken away from kind of doing the boring stuff. So I think some of the questions that are being posed now around, you know, to what extent was the Israeli political executive focused on political polarizing issues rather than resourcing security properly? There's then these quite interesting questions in the US. So due to their shutdown, there are some senior US military posts that currently are diplomatic posts, including there's currently no US ambassador to Israel. And I'm sure many of you heard the Today program this morning and heard General Petraeus, who was formerly director of the CIA, asked by Justin on the Today program, does the lack of political consensus in the US reduce the threat of the two carrier groups that are in the Eastern Mediterranean? I think that's utterly fascinating in terms of the question. So there we go. I think last thought is messaging in organisations. It is really genuinely difficult to say anything on this subject without attracting a response. It's an emotional, inflammatory subject, and there's a kind of workforce issue here and an external issue, which is that anything that is said raises the risk of some form of either, emotional or even malicious response.
Thank you, Chris. Really appreciate that perspective. In the rest of this webinar, what we're really going to look at is Chris's broader perspective on what some of the malicious risks are that you should be aware of and maybe understand a little bit more about. And, towards the end of the session, we'll be also drawing that into the kind of so what's. What are the real implications of some of those geopolitical things going on out there? What do they mean for your business? What do they mean for resilience? What do they mean for your crisis management planning? So I guess to kick this off, Chris, 12 months ago in your excellent annual malicious risks report, at that point you were talking about 4 key areas: strategic competition, expansion in non-state armed group activity, exploitation of available technology, and grassroots movements, strikes, riots, and civil commotion. And I wonder, 12 months later, what's changed from your point of view?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and we might go immediately onto the image on the next slide, actually, Jonathan. So, look, these are very significant geopolitical issues. How does that translate to day-to-day work as a resilience professional or even a communication professional? Well, we see that resilience includes, the kind of anticipate, function, prepare for, respond, adapt. And in order to anticipate effectively, it really is necessary to understand the underlying issues that are driving either the intent of malicious actors or indeed creating vulnerability that can be exploited by those malicious actors. So the 4 themes that you covered off sat under these 3 kind of macro drivers of change. And I think those 3 macro drivers of change, so strategic competition, fourth industrial revolution, and climate change, and therefore the kind of decarbonisation of the economy, those 3 things we feel colour the malicious risk environment and are likely to remain highly relevant this year. Indeed, I think probably for the next decade or so, these 3 issues are going to interact with each other. And therefore, one might describe the international system in what might be described as a kind of transitional phase. So there are people who are a lot brighter than me who have kind of come up with some analysis of this, and I think VUCA is not a bad, and it's a fairly widely adopted acronym. So that describes an economy where we have volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I think I'd certainly agree that that's what we see in the risk environment, both domestically and internationally. These issues that, they impact societal cohesion. And that's where it's possible to create the opportunity for alternative narratives of malicious actors to make sense to people. When these things interact and people are feeling that they're not being looked after by their nation state or the people that are supposed to be looking after their best interests, that's when those alternative narratives become compelling. So I think we accept that from a resilience perspective, these 3 issues and how they interact are, global issues outside of an organization's control. But I think there is a requirement for us to anticipate how they might impact us as resilience professionals in order that we can respond effectively and in order that we can build our infrastructure appropriately to what might affect us during what is, I think, probably widely agreed as a transitional phase in the global economy. So, for example, if your business is, well in the middle of the carbon economy, then you can expect protest activity, and you can perhaps expect direct targeting of your senior executives. If you're a company and you have significant exposure in Southern Europe, then you can expect you're going to be operating amongst societal issues associated with mass migration, either from historic conflicts, current conflict, or indeed from climate change impacting sub-Saharan Africa. If you are manufacturing, then ensuring that you have not only resilience but also some form of redundancy in your supply chain, particularly for minerals and rare earths, should be part of your planning. So I think there's a point here around understanding the macro in order to ensure that resilience at the operational level is where we would expect it to be. I think there's also increasingly a point here about organisations' relationships with government. So here in the UK in 2021, we had the integrated review of defence and security, and that was kind of refreshed in March of this year. And I mean, it's a pretty interesting read for anybody that's not read it, but I think broadly one might deduce from it that, and I'm going to talk very much in the UK context here, but it's the same, if not more amplified, for example, in the US. You know, in that document, we pretty much accept that economic security and national security cannot be untethered from one another. It pretty much describes that geoeconomics, or the use of economic instruments to further a nation state's geopolitical objectives, is now a reasonable kind of set of actions that a government might take. And it also hints quite strongly, I think, that we're likely to see increasing sanctions activity, that we might get further investment screening, and that there might be either trade restrictions or soft pressure applied on organisations to align with the intent of, in this instance, UK PLC. Finally, at the kind of bottom bit here, where climate change or decarbonisation and, fourth industrial revolution, and particularly misinformation and disinformation align. You know, we've got 3 major election cycles in the next 12 months or so, in the US, India, and the UK, and I think we might see some of these issues play out. Certainly, we're expecting to see what we'd refer to as SRCC. Sorry, I've just realised I've put up an insurance acronym. We're awful in the insurance industry for acronyms. So SRCC is strikes, riots, and civil commotion. We certainly expect that there's likely to be an increase in those events over the US election cycle, and I would evidence the significant uptick in US organisations buying insurance cover for this type of event as a kind of informative, perhaps bellwether to what might happen in the coming 12 months. So yeah, those 3 macro drivers, Jonathan: strategic competition, climate change, decarbonisation, and fourth industrial revolution, very much we see as informing the malicious risk environment.
Okay, so
now and over the next decade.
So we'll move on to some of those risk themes that kind of emerge out of this context. Just before we do so, for everybody on the call, please do post your questions to the question pane on your control panel. We'll be taking those at the end of the session, but please do get those logged, and we'll deal with as many of them at the end of this session as we can. So risk themes, Chris. I think there are 3 particular areas that you're seeing. Should we take a look at the first?
Yeah, so we've identified these kind of 3 associated themes that have crystallized over the last year or so. I think they're probably worth considering. So this first one, energy transition. I'll also cover off the race for technology superiority, and then political polarization. And then at the end of the 3 of them, I think perhaps we might just consider some of the perspective on what this means in terms of, you know, what malicious risks and what that might, what attention people might want to focus on in the risk register around particular events. So in terms of energy transition, we are certainly seeing increased use of geoeconomics associated with this change from petrostates to electrostates. And I think this year has already been utterly fascinating, if I'm honest. So there is a crossover here with the next point I'll make around the kind of race for technology superiority. But it is interesting to see the extent to which particularly the US and Chinese economies are decoupling around these issues, particularly around minerals and rare earths. So we're already tracking, not just us, you know, you can already track a significant amount of what one might call resource nationalism. So the International Energy Association identifies kind of big 4 minerals and then about 17 rare elements. And, you know, these are the ones required for advanced electronics, green technologies and the like. The big 4 being cobalt, copper, lithium and nickel. And I'm just going to focus on lithium a little bit because I think it's informative. So lithium carbonate, the kind of unit price over the 6 years to 2021 kind of hovered below and then just over and then back again below $100. And that was kind of stable for about 6 years to at tail end of 2021. I checked yesterday and it was trading at $563. So, you know, a nearly 6 times increase over a 2-year period. The estimate based on the amount of infrastructure, you know, economies are going to need to build to meet 2030 targets is that there's going to need to be a 3.5 times increase in the amount of lithium carbonate available in the economy. And if we're to meet our 2050 targets, there's a 30 times usage increase from 2030 to 2050. So I think it's fair to say there is a genuine scramble for resources, which is including some fairly uncollaborative nationalism. And certainly in the environments where we're seeing these minerals, we're also seeing the raising of historical inequities between those economies that are now developed and evolved and those places where we didn't necessarily have that before. So, you know, nations with significant lithium, with Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Australia, Namibia. And I note that last year, Zimbabwe nationalized all of its lithium and banned exports. 2022 Mexico is interesting. So in 2022, Mexico nationalized all lithium. And then in February of this year, they handed over control of those lithium deposits to their energy ministry. President Obrador stated something along the lines of, and if I've misquoted him, President Obrador, I apologize. I think he's unlikely to watch this webinar.
You never know.
Something along the lines of, it's too important for our national security needs for our production of lithium to be stopped or be exploited by foreigners from Russia, China, or the US, which I think is particularly interesting. Anyway, Indonesia have also got a bauxite export ban. In sub-Saharan Africa, I think utterly fascinating that Mali has significant deposits, but actually its coup this year means that they're just not in a position where they can exploit that opportunity. And I think in that regard, DRC is also a cautionary tale. You know, these countries are unstable. It's difficult to access them, but it's entirely possible that because of the increase in requirement to access them, that businesses aligned with, for example, the US, UK included, might be required to go and solve for that. So we are going to see this change, which is going to affect either the requirement to travel to hostile and non-permissive environments and or to deal with the kind of backdraft afterwards. And then I think finally, it is worth just considering that there's a big list of states that have benefited from oil and gas production over the last 5 decades or so. And they are not, if you look at the map, and I was going to put it up, but it means that people might need to ask for our report. If you cross over the two, kind of petrostates and electrostates, there's not much crossover. So, if you think about states like Saudi, they've got a really delicate transition to navigate over the next decade or so as they try and move their economy away from oil and into other things. And if they get that wrong, certainly the street and the state might disagree with each other. So what? Well, I think it's worth organizations understanding what exposure they might have to increasingly assertive jurisdictions. I think it's worth organizations considering, they are exposed to this stuff on manufacturing, whether they are likely to experience export controls, restrictions on staff working in certain countries, or communicating. And then I think also just considering whether as a business you might be required or strongly encouraged to overtly align with the interests, in our case of UK PLC, and how that might affect your relationships elsewhere.
Okay.
That's kind of it on, I think, on that piece. Yeah, so tech superiority. I'm going to whiz over this one, I think, Jonathan, because it is something that, frankly, we could talk about for an hour or so. But you would expect sectors, legacy sectors like aerospace, to be viewed as a vector for military superiority. But if you accept this point from, for example, the integrated review in the UK, that economic and national security are conjoined, then actually there's a wide range of sectors that provide economic advantage and, frankly, are considered fair game in the race for superiority. So I think anyone who's involved with AI or biotech or supercomputing, knows this already and will have experienced significant involvement, state involvement in protecting their IP and around their kind of IT and cyber infrastructure. But I think there are a whole range of other industries that are now coming into this sphere. Interestingly, China, who don't necessarily have the kind of procurement systems that the US, UK, and EU states do, which were designed in the kind of 80s and 90s and are quite monolithic, slow moving. They've designed a system which is far more agile, and they employ this kind of doctrine of military civil fusion. And that means that they are potentially better able to move forward quickly in technology development and exploitation. But that's a whole another subject, I think. But it does have impact. So, the US 2018 Export Control Reform Act has an increasingly wide list of controlled entities. It scrutinizes Chinese investment in US tech, and I think that kind of bleeds into UK tech as well now. I think we're increasingly seeing an expectation of bifurcation of technology systems, certainly information assets, inside entities, if they're servicing US or kind of Five Eyes or NATO markets and also Asian markets. And, by way of example, so we work with all of the Five Eyes governments apart from one, and we have an ethical test that we're required to apply for who we can and can't work with. And we also have a completely separate IT system that we use for travel to certain regions and countries. And I don't think that's unusual. And I think organizations from a resilience perspective are probably going to have to think about that. So anyway, given the US clout, I think some countries are being forced into recalibrating their positions and having to choose, which is one of the things that we'll talk about. And, practically, I note that both the Netherlands and Japan signed a deal with the US in January of this year, voluntarily implementing export controls on advanced semiconductor technology. So, people are having to choose around this race for technology. And I think that supply chain piece, kind of, we're increasingly seeing people having to navigate these issues preemptively. So, China for China is something that people are very familiar with. So ensuring that the supply chain for China is in China and not exposed elsewhere, or that the rest of the world is not exposed to China's supply chain. And then we get these kind of shoring analogies. So we're seeing quite a lot of reshoring or onshoring of services, seeing some near-shoring. So let's take that out of that particular country and put it nearby, or friend shoring, i.e. let's align around the political organizations that or the national political relationships that we have, and ensure that the supply chain is broadly there. So finally on that, I would say that around the malicious cyber piece, again, which is just a whole presentation in itself. But we are seeing states using non-state actors to conduct operations, well below the threshold of war. And in July of this year, Director of the UK National Crime Agency formally noted the emerging links between serious and organised crime and hostile states. And I think that's utterly fascinating, particularly, again, if you go to the context of Iran using proxies, what's going on in Israel at the moment, that other nation states who are certainly hostile to the UK and the US are using organised crime groups in the cyber domain to cause trouble. So last thing on that is that any of the audience who are familiar with their cybersecurity arrangements, I'm sure will be aware of tools like Worm GPT. So that's a kind of version of Chat GPT, but all the safeguards have been taken out to prevent against answers to questions with malicious intent. So it kind of lowers the bar significantly for anyone who wants to produce convincing business email compromise messaging, or indeed, Worm GPT, you can write Python code with it that produces malicious software for you. So it's a kind of step change in what's going on around malicious cyber. So I think we've certainly considered how the expansion of sectors considered important for national security might impact our organisation. I think others should do the same. I think will measures by other states to become self-sufficient in their supply chain impact businesses domiciled here in the UK? I think there's the question around where data is hosted, and I think there is a question around effective controls relating to insider threat if you're exposed to any of the technologies that might be viewed as kind of in scope in the race for tech superiority.
And just picking up on the cyber threat, Chris, do you think organizations are disproportionately concerned about cybersecurity in terms of planning, training and exercising, or do you think they are right to focus on that as potentially the biggest threat to their business?
Yeah, I think it depends on the context of the business as to what's the biggest threat. But no, I don't think it's wasted effort. You and I talk quite a lot about, the benefits of planning in itself as opposed to whatever the scenario is.
Yeah.
But no, I think, and it's one of the things that I'll mention later, I think there's been a lot of focus internally. I think one of the areas where, people like the NCSC would also, they're communicating on this a lot, is the kind of awareness in the supply chain.
Yes.
Where is your data? So I think the level of resource allocation to cybersecurity activity in-house is probably proportionate. From an insurance perspective, if you look at the claims ratios around cyber extortion, certainly the event frequency is there. It's happening a lot. People are being affected. Yeah. But I think the one area that everyone kind of points at is the supply chain. It's not just about understanding where the data is in your, SharePoint infrastructure. It's also about mapping and acknowledging where your stuff is and who's got control of it, because that seems to be where most of the problems come from. Thank
you. We'll move back to the political environment for your third.
Yeah, last one is the kind of political polarization. And look, I think there's this kind of point around big P political about the blocks that are out there. So, everyone's pretty familiar with NATO. I'll admit that tail end last year, I had to read up on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China, Russia, and as of 2023, Iran is a full member. I think that's quite interesting given current context. But also this move towards smaller groups. So the Quad in APAC that the US has set up, or AUKUS, which again the US has set up around sharing of nuclear technology around attack submarines with the Brits and the Australians. And there is a view that this move down to the kind of smaller groups, the phrase is mini-lateralism, forgive me for that, potentially is a mitigation against the risk that the US kind of changes focus every 4 years at the moment, and that might continue for a while. Discuss. But I think practically the hardening of the discourse between these blocks means that businesses and other organizations might be compelled with a small c or strongly encouraged to align with one or the other. And I think that's probably new in our lifetimes. People would have been used to it in the 70s and 80s with, you know, the Cold War, but I think it probably is a slightly new dynamic for business leaders, organization leaders now. From a more kind of on the street perspective, I think, and again, UK or indeed US or Western Europe, you know, you layer on cost of living crisis, climate change, the kind of identity politics, Israel-Palestine, and you've just got an increased frequency, and we've got data we produce on this. There is an increased frequency of riots and civil commotion in all the developed economies at the moment, just kind of fact. I think they present challenges for businesses, even if you're not targeted. So there's a kind of duty of care obligation, particularly if your offices are in central London. You ought to have a plan for, you know, what you do with your staff when there's a riot. And I think compounding an increasingly kind of febrile atmosphere is the growing influence of the accidental use of misinformation and the deliberate use of disinformation. So certainly as we enter election cycles in the US, India, UK, I think we can expect to see well orchestrated disinformation campaigns and a deliberate attempt to reduce trust in the election process, if that trust already isn't, you know, thinking about the US, but particularly, Bobby. And I think, put simply, let's join that together. So, put simply, if there's election violence in India, and there was in the last cycle, if there's election violence in India, there are a lot of UK companies who've got outsourced operations which might be affected. Or we might need to start thinking about that from a kind of resilience perspective. So I just think this whole piece inevitably has an impact on the workforce, you know, and if employees are feeling disenfranchised, that can put people on a pathway either to agitate internally, or if they don't want to agitate, it can put them on a quiet pathway to being an insider. So what for me is, I think you've got to map and understand whether you're exposed to any of the lightning rod issues. So whether you're likely to be directly targeted by strikes, riots, civil commotion. I think if you're communicating about it, who are you disenfranchising? Because if you communicate on any of these lightning rod issues, you're going to upset someone. And practically, do you have reasonable plans in place to keep your people safe as and when there are higher frequency of civil commotion or riots in whatever the city is that you live in?
Thank you. So I guess we're kind of now into the final straight in terms of the so what these threats mean for the organisations represented on this call. And again, if you haven't posted a question and have one, we're probably into the final 5 to 10 minutes of us talking. So please post any further questions in the next 5 minutes and we'll get through as many as possible. So yeah, Chris, so the operating challenges arising out of what you've just described.
Yeah, I'm going to go back one slide if I may, just to that, because I think I've talked quite a bit about, you know, big hand, wavy hand. I've been a bit wavy hand, you know, geopolitical, and I do want to draw just a couple of practical observations for people around, you know, what kind of events, not the specifics, but what kind of events, therefore, might it be reasonable to say, well, look, these could manifest. We ought to understand what we would do if they would happen. And I'm just going to draw out 4 quickly, if I may, Jonathan. So I think it's fair to say terrorism hasn't gone away. Lone actor has certainly been the norm in the UK for a while, but I think brushing off the plans for you know, how do we as an organisation respond if there's a more coordinated attack in London would be sensible. You know, we've got the Hamas events in Israel, there were events in Brussels last night, and certainly this morning when I looked, there was still a lockdown. We've had a recent arrest of a bomb maker in the UK, and there's a possibility that there's a vehicle as a weapon attack in the US. We'll wait to see what happens there. But the first one is terrorism's not gone away. Second one, strikes right, civil commotion, so riot and protests. There are going to be more protests, and depending on an organisation's profile, I think you do need to consider, you know, whether you're going to be directly or accidentally targeted. You know, it could be around any of those issues that we talked about, and certainly if you put your head above the parapet on any of the lightning rod polarising issues, you can expect to protest. Cyber we've talked about, but I think that remains an evolving concern. I think, and you kind of covered it, but the routine extortion risks, business email compromise, I think is there, but I think it's either the insider threat piece, because that's really complicated to manage,
yes,
or it's the supply chain. And I think knowing who has access to your sensitive data is something that not everyone is across. And then the final one of the four, practically, and we've seen, I've been surprised how much of this we've seen in the last, I don't know, 6 to 9 months, is direct targeting of senior executives.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be around a communication misstep, or around an organisation that's involved in you know, carbon economy or whatever. But that's we've seen direct doxing of senior executives. So that's kind of making their private information public. Threats at home. Some quite unpleasant stuff around kids, false accusations of a libelous nature, attempts to cancel individuals from aspects of both their work and private life. And I think those four things, so kind of terrorism, riots, evolving concerns in cyber, and threats to executives, I think are the things I would draw out from that kind of big hand, wavy hand piece. Sorry, and then I'll cover off the last two bits in a timely fashion, Jonathan.
Thanks, Chris.
So look, yeah, the operating challenges really are where we spend a lot of time supporting clients who have normally got fairly mature resilience arrangements, but where they're seeking help. So, and forgive the kind of slightly busy diagram, but I'll try and explain it if I can. So look, we've got the issues that I've described over on the left-hand side, those kind of macro drivers of change, and the three themes that we think are interesting this year. And on the right-hand side, we've got these kind of three areas of resilience that we're all very familiar with. So the kind of strategic bit around how do we position long-term planning, the kind of operational stuff, which heads of resilience or heads of communication or people called director of business continuity management or whatever, that, you know, that's that bit. And then this information piece around cyber. But I think the kind of the challenge is around these three issues in the middle, really, the kind of operating context. So that's the fact that the change isn't measured, linear, you can't map it out. It's lumpy, you know, and it's unexpected. So change is happening at a very unsettling pace when it happens. And that means that it can be difficult to ensure that resilience arrangements keep up. I think the uncertainty piece can also be a challenge, because using historical looking data to determine what's a reasonable scenario going forward doesn't really cut it. You know, a lot of the major things that have impacted our resilience over the last 3-4 years, you know, COVID, war in Ukraine, the scale of the Hamas attacks in Israel, you know, if I were to have used any of those three things before they happened as a scenario in a resilience exercise, I'd quite reasonably be told, you know, this doesn't help doing this type of thing. So I think that uncertainty is a challenge.
Yes.
And then I think finally this need to choose piece, and that's got two aspects for me. The first, at the macro level, is that organizations, I think, have not been used to, and perhaps may not be prepared for, the idea that they might be required to align with national interest. I think that's going to be new for some organizations, and it may well practically affect what businesses do and where they do it. But also on the need to choose is that because of the non-linear progress and uncertainty, often when we're sat with crisis management teams, that they are having to make decisions without the requisite information. And that can be really unsettling and uncomfortable for people, where an organization recognizes that, well, it's got to make a decision and it's probably not equipped with the right amount of information because of the nature of the operating environment. I think we're on to the last slide.
We are indeed.
So you and I spoke about the kind of shared, when we've got some shared clients, but the things that seem to be consistent at the moment. I think this first one is the most important for me, which is event agnostic resilience. So having a plan which says how you're going to respond to 5 very specific scenarios is great, but those 5 specific scenarios aren't going to happen. It's around agnostic resilience, and it's the active planning in itself which seems to us to be the most valuable for the crisis management teams and others that we work with. And I think you find the same on a very operational level. Within that, having the simple plans that provide that kind of agility and flexibility are really important. So the boring stuff, this is now, so mass notifications so that you can get in touch with everybody that works for you or anyone that's touching you as an organization. Things like having a process in place to every year update voluntary next of kin information if that's the way it needs to go, and then having confidence not only at the top table but also for people in the business that you have an effective lockdown and evacuation plan, I think are just hugely important. So those two I think go together. Event agnostic and have simple plans that you can put together and make things happen. I do think that the political polarization thing, it is increasingly where we find clients asking us for advice, and I think you've just got to map it. You've got to understand where you might be exposed. So, for example, in the hotel sector, we have a client who found themselves organising an event for a particularly right of centre political group in a hotel in DC, concurrently with a particularly left-leaning group, and it was a disaster. And it's a kind of, I know that's a fairly straightforward example, but actually we all have clients who, if you were to put them in a room, would really get on with each other. And equally at the moment, I'm sure organisations have clients who you really can't bring together. And sometimes they can be genuinely upset if they think you are servicing, so we're very open about it. We do service clients in the carbon economy, and we explain that, and we explain our rationale, and we're very comfortable with it. But that can have an impact on protest risk. And I think with colleagues, understanding and mapping where that might create problems is hugely important. So mapping the polarization risk, there's not a lot you can do about it apart from understand where it might happen. And then finally, supply chain, which, as I've said, is kind of implied in everything I talked about around battle for resources or indeed technology. So understanding geographically or politically where your supply chain is exposed, but also just knowing in your own operations where, from a data perspective, you have any of your crown jewels apart from in your own infrastructure, and ensuring that those third-party providers have an analogous level of resilience. So even we, as a relatively small business, when we now transact with third parties, we ask for their business continuity management arrangements, and we ask to see their cybersecurity arrangements. Now, often that's just, they'll say, look, with Cyber Essentials Plus or whatever it might be, but we ask that now when we deal with people who come and clean our office. We ask. So there you go. So look, a quick rattle through, Jonathan, but hopefully a nice linking of those 3 macro drivers, which I just think aren't going to change for the next decade or so, and how they interact. Those kind of risk themes that we're seeing at the moment, particularly around petrostates to electrostates and that competition for natural resources. The piece around, and it is aligned around the battle for technology, and then finally this piece around political polarization, and then hopefully the so what that comes out of that in terms of the types of events that we think we're likely to see, the challenges that the organisations we work with are facing, and what the considerations ought to be really for senior leaders.
Chris, thank you. And we have got time for a couple of questions. If we don't get to all of them, then by scanning the QR code, you will immediately get to an email to be sent to Chris for further information or questions that we can't cover in the next few minutes. So there are a couple, Chris, that I'm definitely going to try and get through before we do the summary. The first one is from Stephen, who says, we're always told in crisis management that it's important to learn from every crisis. What are some of the learnings you would take out of the Ukraine-Russian conflict?
Well, yeah, okay, that's a good question. Well, let's think about the organisations we worked with at the time. I think one of them is around kind of evacuation and repatriation piece.
Yeah.
So this is a kind of event agnostic. So it doesn't really matter why it's happened, but it is a kind of event agnostic thing, really, which is when you've got people working in third countries. Understanding the process you might go through either to reduce headcount, if you just want to kind of wait and see if it's not clear that it's gone, fully kinetic straight away, to reduce headcount, and or the process you might use to hibernate a business. So, leaving local nationals to keep office open whilst international people move, and or I think that then implied piece, which comes onto this strategic competition piece, which is understanding if an event occurs, which means that it will no longer be appropriate for you to operate in a particular region.
Yeah.
What is reasonable in terms of how the people who are there still get to operate. So I would use the example of, let's try and ensure that I don't. So I would use the example of a vehicle manufacturer and sales organization who simply divested themselves of their business in Russia, but lent it money to ensure that the workforce that were there, who'd been, very loyal workforce, and who aren't politicians, they're Russian citizens running that business, could continue to run the business with the financial arrangements with Topco, but that was in a way that met all the sanctions regimes appropriately, but also allowed the business to demonstrate that it was doing the right thing. So, Stephen, it's a really good question. I think the main point for me is that pre-planning around, and again, it's just a pre-planning rather than the plan being perfect, around evacuation and repatriation, around how you can reduce exposure, how you might hibernate, and then if you do have to bifurcate a particular region or country, how you might bifurcate whilst retaining the people and doing the right thing.
Chris, I'm going to throw one more at you. We've got two actually, and I'm going to try and cover off the second one myself in my kind of wrap up. But from Martin, do you consider recent events may provide a further catalyst for increased hostage taking as a tool to leverage influence?
Yeah. So I know there's somebody on the call who's in our world, if you like, in the kind of kidnap for ransom space. Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is it's horrific. Any hostage taking is just deeply unpleasant, and actually the effects go on for years afterwards. So first thing is, I ought to accept that. Yes, I do. I think so often hostage taking occurs where there is a kind of a differential between the street and the financial position of those people that are coming into a country or a region. So, for example, oil executives being picked up in Latin America, Southeast Asia, or Sub-Saharan Africa, or extractives. And I think going to that point around the battle for minerals, the big four, and the kind of 17 rare earth metals, most of those are not in available underneath the high streets of well-developed nations. They're in areas where there is a real disparity of wealth, and I think you can layer on a whole number of issues there. So, you know, colonialism and you know, legacy historical concerns. Yes, I do think there will be increased, whether you call it kidnapping or hostage taking, they've got a slightly different definition. But yeah, sadly I do. I wouldn't want to overstate it, because actually there's a lot fewer than you might imagine globally. But the only thing that is reassuring is that if it's happening for leverage, and for example here in Israel it is happening for leverage, you've got to hope that the other side realizes that therefore the asset they've got is the leverage, and that it's in their interest to look after that individual. But yeah, Martin, it's a really good question, and I think sadly probably we will see an increase in frequency around hostage taking, kidnapping.
Chris, thank you. I'm just going to sum up over the next 4 or 5 minutes. Firstly, yeah, thank you, Chris. I think there's tremendous insight, tremendous food for thought there. And whilst some of the things that we're considering there are very unpalatable, they are there. And as resilience and crisis management professionals, it's incumbent upon us to do whatever we can to plan and prepare for them. And Amy asked about being event agnostic in resilience, what that really meant. And if I can lend a couple of words there, it is about having a way of working in a crisis, the right advisors and the right resources and capabilities to be able to respond whatever the situation is, rather than, as Chris described earlier, a very fixed playbook focused on your top 5 or top 10 risks, which can be much more of a, well, probably less use than a straitjacket if actually it's the 11th or 12th or 1057th risk that occurs. So for us, a good crisis management plan and a good crisis management team are designed to operate in a purposeful, structured, focused, timely manner, whatever the crisis is, not just your top 5 risks. I think a couple of other themes that came out for me that I would want to underline would be think the unthinkable. This thing about Chris saying, you know, what's happened recently is not something that anyone would have predicted. I think developing that thought, really planning for the worst case, thinking the unthinkable. I recall someone from the mining sector, not actually a client, but someone I met at a conference, who said, you know, a tailings dam being destroyed was something that they never rehearsed for, because nobody believed that in reality that would happen. When it happened to them, they were literally and metaphorically overwhelmed. Now, not every year, but every 3 years, they will rehearse against the most cataclysmic event, the unthinkable that they almost believe couldn't happen. But their view is if you're prepared for that, you're prepared for anything less significant. So again, thanks, Chris, and please everyone take what Chris has shared today and work out what it might mean in terms of practical implications for your organization. 3 minutes of housekeeping to conclude. Firstly, our final webinar of the year will be on Tuesday the 5th of December. You will receive an invitation to that. It will be looking back on 2023 and to Anthony's question, I think it was, or Stephen, I forget which, my apologies. We'll be looking at what learnings can we take from the crises this year, and building really on Chris's presentation, what do we believe the priorities for next year will be. If you haven't already done so and you're thinking about your 2024 planning, do take our crisis readiness test. It's online on our website, front and center. It will give you a free online assessment of where you're strong and where you might want to focus your efforts in 2024.
And it's really
We're
good.
also, thank you. We're also talking about benchmark against ISO 22361. We have, again, a benchmarking service. So for those of you who want to understand how you stack up against the standards, against best practice, maybe to persuade some of your peers who are less willing to spend time on crisis management, this can be a very useful starting point and an objective starting point for opening up that conversation. And finally, in terms of stuff from us, once more on this session, we've got a really good attendance and wanted to offer 3 people a free copy of Crisis Proof. So if you haven't already read my book, then please respond to the email that will be coming out after this session saying that you'd like a copy, and however many names there are that would like one, we'll put them into a hat, and 3 of you we will send a copy of Crisis Proof too. Competing with Chris's QR code. We didn't have a QR code until we saw Chris's. We now do. We're very, very responsive here at Insignia. So if you'd like to contact me, please just scan this code and that will get you straight through to me too. So thanks once more to Chris, really insightful, really valuable. It's now up to all of us on this call to act on it. Thank you to everyone who's joined us, and I wish you all a pleasant and hopefully crisis-free afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.